In one of Atlanta's prestigious suburbs, where neat lawns and gleaming house facades create the illusion of perfect order, Cassandra Cassie Wilson, a 38-year-old African-American woman, lives surrounded by comfort and abundance. She is married to Lamar Wilson, a 42-year-old successful entrepreneur who made a name for himself in consulting and business. The Wilson family has always been a symbol of success and status for the locals. Cassie's home is a two-story colonial mansion with a grand facade, seemingly isolated from all the worries of the world. Large windows, gleaming black gates, and a perfectly manicured garden highlight the family's wealth and social standing. On the surface, everything in their life seemed flawless. Expensive cars, appearances at charity events, and annual trips abroad. Anyone who saw this couple could only envy them. But beneath these privileges lay a darker, decaying undercurrent in their relationship. Within the luxurious walls, their marriage was little more than an empty shell. Lamar, deeply immersed in his career and constant business trips, spent less and less time at home, consumed by work and the money he earned for their family. Though he always tried to be a responsible and providing husband, Lamar had long since stopped noticing his wife's inner turmoil. The beginning of the end. After another long business trip, Lamar returned home for just a few days before leaving again for important negotiations. His presence at home had become nearly invisible. There were fewer conversations, less attention to his wife, and though Lamar wasn't unfaithful, the emotional distance between them became increasingly apparent. Cassie had grown accustomed to the silence and loneliness that slowly consumed her from within. Lamar, unaware of this, believed that material stability and high social status compensated for the lack of closeness. For Cassie, the life she led felt like a gilded cage. Though she had everything, money, social standing, and her husband's successful career, what she lacked was something truly important: warmth and love. She increasingly found herself asking, "What really matters to me?" She remembered how, at the beginning of their marriage, they could talk for hours about everything, how Lamar used to look at her with admiration. Now that was gone. His eyes were only occupied by contracts and business reports, the growing sense of alienation. Lamar left for yet another business trip, leaving Cassie alone for the entire month of November. By this point, she barely felt like a wife anymore, more like a woman forgotten by her own husband. She started noticing how her conversations with friends and neighbors had become superficial. She tried to keep up appearances at social events, hiding her disappointment behind polite smiles and empty chatter. Her only solace was her evening walks around the neighborhood and the occasional casual chats with neighbors. It was during these walks that she began to run into Marius Carter, the 22-year-old son of their neighbors. He was young, full of energy and ambition, and something about his carefree attitude and freedom drew Cassie in. Their first conversations over the fence were light and easy, but each time she saw him, she felt something stir inside her. She found herself enjoying just talking to him, hearing his laughter, and seeing his genuine interest in her life. The lonely days became more unbearable. While Lamar was away on yet another trip, Cassie started seeking more opportunities to spend time with Marius. And though she convinced herself these were just innocent conversations, something deeper was beginning to grow within her. Her thoughts were increasingly occupied by him. She noticed how she eagerly awaited his return home just to accidentally run into him on the street or near the fence. Meanwhile, the neighborhood gossip, Mrs. Mace, began to notice the growing attention Cassie paid to Marius and didn't miss the chance to share her observations with other neighbors. Despite the seemingly innocent nature of their interactions, tension was building and rumors began to spread. On the surface, Cassie's life continued to appear as perfect as ever, but behind closed doors, her home and marriage were becoming an arena for hidden desires and inner turmoil. The warm days of December in Atlanta brought with them a special atmosphere in the luxurious suburb where Cassandra Cassie Wilson lived. Despite the approaching holiday season, a deep emptiness was growing in her heart. Lamar was away on another business trip, and the house that once felt grand and full of life now felt like a cold cage. But this time, something new was happening in her life. Constant, random encounters with Marius Carter, the neighbor's son, who had just recently graduated from college. Marius, a 22-year-old young man with charm and ambition, frequently visited his parents' house. He couldn't help but notice Cassie, a sophisticated, beautiful woman, always so perfectly composed despite years of marriage. In their initial conversations over the fence, Cassie smiled, but something inside her shifted. She noticed how his youth and energy awakened feelings in her that she thought had long been buried under the weight of time and responsibilities. One day in early December, as Cassie watered the flowers in her backyard, Maris approached the fence, joking about how cold winter was coming to their city. Their conversation started innocently, talking about the weather, exchanging light jokes about the upcoming holidays. But beneath the surface, there was hidden tension. Their eyes lingered on each other just a little longer than necessary, and in those fleeting glances, there were hints of something more. Cassie smiled a little warmer than usual, and Maris could feel himself being drawn to her more and more. One evening, as Cassie returned home from grocery shopping, she noticed Maris helping his father fix a car in the driveway. He greeted her with a charming smile, and Cassie felt her heart race. At first glance, it seemed like a simple, friendly exchange, but the tension between them grew with each passing day. Maris had long felt an attraction to Cassie. She was no longer just the neighbor. To him, she was a woman who needed something more than what her husband could provide, and he liked thinking that he could be the one to fill that void. Another casual conversation by the fence turned into long moments of silence, broken by short phrases. That day, Cassie wore a dress that accentuated her figure, and Marius couldn't take his eyes off her. Their conversation touched on books they were both reading. Marius mentioned he had recently taken an interest in psychology, which opened a new window for Cassie. She began to share her thoughts about life and how her marriage wasn't as perfect as it seemed from the outside. Though she spoke carefully between the lines, it became clear that she felt empty. After another long day spent in loneliness, Cassie decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. She wasn't surprised when she ran into Marius again. It was as if he was always there when she needed him. Their conversations grew more personal with each encounter. Marius began to understand that Cassie wasn't just beautiful, she was deeply lonely, and this opened a new dimension of attraction for him. He no longer saw her as just a neighbor or mentor. He began fantasizing about what it would be like for them to be together. That evening, standing by the fence, they both felt something growing between them, something they weren't quite ready to acknowledge. Marius wasn't just admiring Cassie anymore. He craved her attention and started spending more time outside, waiting for the next chance to meet. He began wondering just how far they could go. Everything changed that day. Lamar was once again away on a business trip, and Cassie invited Marius over, supposedly to help fix some faucets. They were alone. Once inside, Marius noticed how empty and cold the house felt, but he couldn't help but notice how warm and inviting Cassie looked within that space. She offered him tea, and their conversations continued, but this time the atmosphere became charged. They sat too close, their hands accidentally brushing against each other, and Marius felt his heart race. Cassie didn't pull away. On the contrary, it seemed as though she was signaling that her feelings mirrored his. During another visit, Marius no longer hid his attraction. Their conversations became more suggestive. Cassie began to realize that Marius wasn't just a young neighbor to her. He was awakening emotions she hadn't felt in a long time. That night, they shared their first kiss. It was a silent acknowledgement that their feelings had crossed a line they couldn't return from. However, at the same time, their neighbor, Mrs. Mace, began to notice that Cassie and Marius were meeting far too often. Her suspicions grew when she saw Marius staying at the Wilson house for hours. Her keen attention to their relationship marked the beginning of a series of events that would eventually lead to disastrous consequences. What started as a seemingly innocent attraction slowly morphed into something far more dangerous. The last days of December became a turning point for Cassie and Marius. Their secret affair was gaining momentum, and what was once forbidden desire had now become full-blown passion. Every time Lamar left for another business trip, the Wilson home became a refuge for their secret encounters. They met in secret, confident that no one would find out. But with each meeting, their caution was replaced by increasing risk. Lamar was once again away, and Marius came to Cassie's house for the first time since their kiss. Now their meetings had moved beyond innocence, and the passion between them spiraled out of control. Their physical closeness became more frequent, But with each encounter, they felt the tension growing. Cassie knew the risk was high, but each time they were together, it became harder for her to resist her desires. For Marius, the adrenaline rush from each moment spent at Cassie's house was intoxicating. He was not only physically but also emotionally attached to her, and this connection began clouding his judgment. He knew the game they were playing was dangerous, but his confidence in keeping their secret intact only grew. The new year brought with it a fresh wave of passion. Their meetings became more frequent. Every time Lamar left, Marius would come to Cassie's. Their secret dates took place in the house, which maintained an illusion of happiness. They cooked dinners together, watched movies, and for those brief moments, they were like a couple in hiding while Lamar was away. This only deepened their false sense of security, but dark clouds were already gathering. One evening, Mrs. Mace, the elderly neighbor, noticed Marius heading toward the Wilson house once again. It wasn't the first time she'd seen him at Cassie's door, and her suspicions started turning into an obsession. She had always been known for her love of gossip, but this time her attention was focused solely on Cassie. She began keeping a closer eye on the Wilson home, trying to uncover all the small details that could confirm her suspicions. Mrs. Mace noticed that Marius's visits were becoming more frequent, especially when Lamar was away. Her suspicions were confirmed when she saw Marius leaving Cassie's house late one evening. She shared this information with a few neighbors, but, fearing ridicule, kept most of it to herself for now. Lamar returned from another trip, and from that moment, he began noticing subtle changes in his wife's behavior. Cassie became more distracted, spending more time in her room, and her late-night walks around the house became more frequent. At first, Lamar brushed it off as a fluctuation in her mood, but his intuition told him something was wrong. By this time, the passion between Cassie and Marius had reached its peak. They no longer met for brief encounters. Every time Lamar left, they spent entire days together, completely lost in their feelings for one another. However, the mounting tension began to affect their sanity. Cassie experienced mixed emotions. On the one hand, she was enjoying her affair, but on the other, the fear of being caught gripped her with panic. Lamar started feeling more uneasy. He noticed that Cassie was becoming more distant, and his suspicions continued to grow. Her frequent phone calls, her nervousness, and her reluctance to discuss family plans made him more doubtful. By this point, Lamar no longer believed that her behavior was just a coincidence. He decided to take action and secretly hired a private investigator to monitor her movements. The investigator began his work. He tracked Cassie's routes, her conversations with neighbors, and her meetings with Marius. Over the course of a week, he gathered enough evidence to show that Marius regularly visited Cassie while Lamar was away. Although the detective hadn't yet drawn any final conclusions, the first signs of a hidden affair began to emerge. Mrs. Mace decided to take more direct action. She started watching the Wilson house more closely, observing every move Marius made. One evening, around 8 p.m., she noticed that Marius stayed at the house longer than usual. She called one of her friends, sharing her suspicions. Something about these visits seemed far too strange to her. Cassie and Marius were becoming more and more deeply entangled in their affair, but with every meeting, the fear of being caught grew more palpable. Cassie felt her life was beginning to fall apart, but despite this, she couldn't bring herself to end the relationship. Both of them knew too much was at stake, but passion and risk clouded their judgment. A cold February day in Atlanta. Lamar Wilson returned home from his business trip earlier than planned, hoping to surprise his wife. At 2 p.m., his black Mercedes quietly pulled into the driveway of their luxurious home. Lamar hadn't come back early in a long time. His trips usually lasted days, if not weeks. This time, he wanted to spend the evening at home without telling Cassie in advance. Cassie, not expecting him back, was enjoying a quiet day alone with Marius. They had been spending time in the bedroom, certain they had the whole day before Lamar returned. But everything changed the moment Cassie heard the sound of Lamar's car pulling up to the driveway. The seconds leading up to her realization that he was home turned into chaos. Panic gripped her instantly. "That's Lamar! He's home!" she whispered, looking out the window, her heart racing wildly. Marius, also panicking, began dressing hurriedly. Cassie pointed him toward the bathroom, insisting he hide. He barely managed to slip behind the bathroom door just as Lamar entered the house. Cassie's nerves were on edge, and the fear was evident on her face, though she tried her best to hide it. "Cassie, are you home?" Lamar's voice echoed through the house. Cassie quickly composed herself, trying to appear calm. "Yes, honey, I'm here." Her voice sounded slightly louder and more strained than usual. Lamar entered the bedroom, and Cassie, doing her best not to look toward the bathroom, greeted him with a smile that couldn't quite mask her tension. Lamar, as always, was tired from his trip, but this time he noticed something off. The bedroom looked too disheveled, something that wasn't typical for his wife. Her hair was a bit messy, and her clothes weren't as neat as they usually were. Still, he didn't say anything. Lamar walked over to her, kissed her on the cheek, and moved away. But a nagging feeling of unease had already settled in his mind. Lamar walked past the bathroom but didn't open the door. Cassie held her breath, knowing Marius was hiding just a few feet away from them. Standing behind the door, Marius struggled to contain his emotions, feeling the heat of fear coursing through him. Lamar, noticing nothing out of the ordinary, headed to the kitchen to make himself some coffee. As soon as he left, Cassie quickly opened the bathroom door, and Marius slipped out, still shaken by what had just happened. "You need to leave," she whispered, her heart pounding faster than ever. Marius, dressed but still nervous, slipped out through the back door, narrowly avoiding Lamar on his way out. Cassie remained, feeling that this close call had brought them dangerously close to being exposed. She knew she needed to be more careful, but the desire to see Marius again overpowered her fear. Mrs. Mace, the elderly neighbor, had always been someone who saw everything and everyone. Over the past few weeks, she had noticed something odd at the Wilson house. She'd been paying attention to Marius's frequent visits to Cassie's, but the most recent incident solidified her suspicions. Mrs. Mace had noted how often Marius came to the Wilsons' home whenever Lamar was away. It all seemed too suspicious to her. "It looks like Mrs. Wilson has a young visitor," she remarked to her neighbor, Mr. Garner, during their morning walk. Though her words sounded like innocent gossip, they quickly spread throughout the neighborhood. The rumors soon reached Brenda Carter, Marius's deeply religious and strict mother. Hearing that her son was spending a lot of time at Cassie's house made her uneasy. Brenda had always known her son as an obedient, kind young man, but the rumors circulating among the neighbors made her start to question things. She decided to confront Marius directly. "Marius, what's going on?" Brenda asked that evening when Marius returned home. She looked him straight in the eye, hoping for an honest answer. Sensing that the rumors were catching up with him, Marius tried to conceal the truth. He denied everything he could, assuring his mother that it was all just gossip. But deep inside, his fear was growing. He knew their secret relationship was becoming harder to keep under wraps, and the tension within him continued to build. He realized the longer it went on, the more likely someone would discover the truth. Though Brenda didn't get a direct answer, she still suspected her son was hiding something. Full of doubts, she began watching him more closely, hoping that the truth would eventually come to light. The neighborhood began buzzing with these rumors, but Cassie and Marius continued their meetings, fully aware that each step forward might lead to a catastrophic outcome. By early March 2008, the tension in Cassie Wilson's life had become unbearable. The affair, which had begun as a fleeting thrill, had long since stopped bringing her joy. Instead of passion leaving her exhilarated, she now felt constant fear. With each passing day, her feelings toward Marius shifted. At first, she thought she had control over the situation, but now that control was slowly slipping from her grasp. Marius had become obsessive. No longer waiting for her invitations, he began showing up at her house more frequently and at inappropriate times, even when Lamar was in town. Sometimes he just stood outside, his gaze empty and unsettling, but filled with expectation. Cassie started to fear that look, and his behavior frightened her even more. Every time she tried to tell him they had to stop, he acted as if he didn't hear her. Instead, Marius became more insistent, his calmness growing increasingly threatening. Cassie decided to take a day off and spend the day at home, not realizing that this would become one of her most difficult days. Lamar was at work, and her nerves were already stretched to the limit. But the quiet day was shattered when she saw Marius standing outside the house. He hadn't called or warned her of his visit. He just stood there watching her. Panic surged through her. She stepped outside, hoping to explain that it had to end. "You need to leave," she said calmly, trying not to show her fear. "You know I can't," Marius replied, his voice quiet and disturbingly assured. "You're mine, Cassie. We belong to each other." Her heart froze. She didn't recognize the young man she had started the affair with. Now in his eyes, there wasn't just passion, but madness. It was clear that he wasn't going to let her go. Cassie began to notice that Marius was following her, not only at home, but outside of it as well. He appeared at the grocery store where she went shopping, and then she saw his car near the salon when she went to get her hair done. He didn't approach her, but his presence was always felt like a shadow. These weren't coincidences. They were stalking. Now she was afraid not only of being exposed, but also of Marius himself. His obsession had become uncontrollable, and Cassie began to seriously consider ending the affair. But every time she brought up the topic, he threatened to tell Lamar. Marius was at a point where his emotions were spiraling out of control. His love had turned into obsession. Cassie discovered that Marius had left a letter in her mailbox. There were no direct threats, but the tone was ominous. He wrote about how she had betrayed him, that their connection was supposed to be eternal, and that he wouldn't let her go so easily. The letter was signed in his name, but the handwriting was sloppy, as if it had been written in a state of distress. Cassie now realized the situation was spinning out of control. She began thinking about telling Lamar, but she feared his reaction. She knew the truth would destroy their marriage, but silence had become unbearable. Lamar, too, was noticing his wife's strange behavior. She had grown more nervous, tense, and her phone calls had become short and cryptic. His intuition told him something was wrong. That day, he took a step that would change their lives. He decided to install hidden cameras in the house to find out what was happening when he wasn't around. Without saying a word to Cassie, Lamar secretly installed several cameras, hiding them in the living room, kitchen, and hallways. He wanted to understand why his wife had changed so much and what was happening behind his back. He thought it would be a temporary measure, just to confirm his suspicions, but this decision would change their lives forever. The cameras captured strange moments. When Lamar reviewed the footage, he noticed someone appearing in their home while he was away. He didn't yet know it was Marius, but his intuition told him something unsettling was happening in their house. Now he had solid grounds to suspect Cassie of deception. These recordings would become key evidence in the later investigation. But for now, Lamar was just gathering information, unaware of how far things would go. Marius's obsessive behavior and constant pursuit of Cassie, which had once seemed manageable to her, had now become a real threat. This day marked a turning point for Cassie. She knew she couldn't continue this dangerous game any longer. The fear that had been haunting her for weeks had reached its peak. Marius had become too obsessive, and his behavior was now threatening not only her marriage but also her safety. Realizing that her relationship with Marius could destroy everything she had been hiding so carefully, Cassie made the difficult decision to end it once and for all. Her hands were shaking as she dialed Marius's number, inviting him to come over to talk. She had to tell him their affair was over. It was the only way to regain control over her life. Marius arrived at Cassie's house, confident as usual that they would spend another evening together, but he was in for a very different encounter. As soon as he entered the house, Cassie, avoiding his gaze, told him it was over. Her voice was firm, but inside she was filled with fear. She knew this conversation wouldn't be easy. "We need to end this, Marius. It's gone too far," Cassie said, avoiding eye contact. For a few seconds, Marius was silent, trying to process what he had heard, but his expression quickly shifted from shock to anger. "You can't just walk away from me, Cassie. You think I'm going to let you go like that?" His voice was filled with a threatening edge. Marius wasn't going to take rejection lightly. He stepped closer to Cassie, his face reddening with fury. He began accusing her of using him, playing with his emotions and now wanting to discard him. Cassie tried to explain that it was necessary, that things had become too dangerous for both of them, but Marius wasn't listening. "If you leave me, I'll tell Lamar. I'll tell him everything." His voice turned cold and menacing. He threatened to ruin her life, to reveal their affair to her husband if she didn't come back to him. Cassie realized that Marius had crossed a line. Panic began to rise inside her. She tried to back away, but Marius blocked her exit from the room. There was a dangerous resolve in his eyes. Cassie knew that if she didn't calm him down, things could escalate even further. "I can't be with you, Marius." "It's not right," she said, trying to stay calm, but her voice betrayed her. Marius continued to push her, his words growing more aggressive. Cassie took a step back, her back pressed against the bedroom door. Suddenly, instinctively, she slammed the door in his face, locking him inside. She knew it was only a temporary solution, but she needed time to think. Behind the door, Marius started pounding on the wood, yelling that he wasn't leaving until they talked. He was in a state of rage, and Cassie realized her only chance was to get out of the house and call for help. She began moving toward the exit, but Marius, furiously breaking the lock, stormed out after her. His eyes were burning with anger. Their argument escalated into a physical confrontation. Cassie tried to run, but Marius grabbed her by the arm, holding her with force. In a moment of rage and desperation, he shoved her so hard that she couldn't keep her balance. Her body, losing its footing, tumbled down the stairs. It all happened in an instant, but for Cassie, it felt like slow motion. She felt her body falling, the impact of each step, and the sharp pain when she hit the final curve of the staircase. When she landed on the floor, she couldn't move. There was a deafening ringing in her head, and the world around her spun. Pain shot through her back and neck, but she was conscious. Cassie realized that Marius hadn't even tried to help her. He stood at the top of the stairs, his face contorted with a mix of fear and anger. For a few moments, the house fell into silence. Marius, realizing what he had done, stood frozen, seemingly paralyzed. Then, without saying a word, he turned and ran. He fled, leaving Cassie lying at the bottom of the stairs. Cassie, summoning her last reserves of strength, managed to reach the phone and dial 911. She could feel her body giving in to the shock and pain, but she knew she had to call for help. Marius disappeared, but his actions left deep scars, both physical and emotional. After the incident on March 5, 2008, when Cassie found herself at the bottom of the stairs with injuries, her life had become a living nightmare. Marius, realizing that she could now tell Lamar everything, or worse, the police, began losing his grip on reality. His attachment had turned into an obsession, and every day Cassie felt an increasing sense of danger. Fear crept into every aspect of her life. Marius started stalking Cassie more openly. He no longer hid in the shadows. He followed her everywhere. She would see his car parked nearby when she went shopping, and sometimes he would just stand outside her house, staring into her windows. His presence had become a nightmare that seemed never-ending. Cassie was afraid to leave the house, let alone tell Lamar what had happened. Marius seemed omnipresent, and with each passing day, his obsession became more dangerous. "You won't get away from me, Cassie," Marius wrote in one of the messages she received late on the night of March 8th. It was one of the first explicit threats he had sent her after their fight. In the messages, he accused her of betrayal and promised that if she didn't come back to him, it would all end in tragedy. Those words sent shivers down her spine. Cassie's fear intensified. She felt as though every step she took was being tracked, every meeting she had was being monitored. Marius seemed to be playing with her mind, creating an atmosphere of constant terror. One day, after returning home from meeting a friend, she found a letter in her mailbox signed with Marius's name. The letter contained just one sentence: "We will be together again, even if you don't like it." Those words finally broke her. Cassie realized that her life had become a hostage to fear. She didn't know who to turn to. Lamar was her husband, but she feared his reaction if she told him the truth. A plan of silence began forming in her mind, one in which she hoped to just survive this nightmare. But with each passing day, that seemed less and less realistic. Cassie woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps outside her window. It was Marius standing in the shadows. He wasn't moving, but his presence was felt even through the thick curtains. After that, she couldn't sleep. Every noise in the house seemed suspicious. Her mind was on the verge of breaking. Cassie could no longer live a normal life, constantly fearing that every action would lead to something terrible. Meanwhile, Lamar, sensing something wasn't right, continued his own investigation. He had installed cameras and hired private detectives to figure out what his wife was hiding. The cameras had already caught a few strange events: suspicious visits from Marius to Cassie's house and her nervous reactions to phone calls. Lamar was gathering information, But he still couldn't see the full picture. He didn't realize how deep the threat went. Marius decided to take things further. His threats became more direct and frightening. He started showing up in the parking lot of Cassie's office, and even at her parents' house, no longer trying to hide. One day he left a note on the hood of her car, directly threatening her life. "I'll always be here, even if you don't want me to be," it read. And that was the final straw for her. Crushed and overwhelmed by fear, Cassie felt like her life was no longer her own. Her constant anxiety had turned into paranoia. She started seeing threats in every stranger, in every phone call, and every noise in the house sent her into a panic. Marius was no longer just a man she once loved. He had become her personal nightmare, literally following her every step. She thought again about telling Lamar everything, but the fear that Marius might carry out his threats held her back. She felt trapped, unable to see a way out. By that time, Lamar already knew something was happening in his house. The cameras had captured Marius sneaking around, leaving notes, and disappearing. The detectives Lamar had hired began piecing together that his wife was involved in a dangerous situation, but Lamar still didn't know the whole truth. He only saw fragments, but those fragments were beginning to form a bigger picture. Marius continued pressuring Cassie. In his desperation, he was no longer just threatening her. He had started planning how to end her fear once and for all. In his twisted mind, ending her fear meant ending her life. Lamar Wilson returned home, sensing that something was wrong. In his hands were all the necessary evidence, the footage from the cameras that showed everything. He sat in his car, watching the recordings of Marius sneaking up to their house, leaving notes and seeing Cassie desperately trying to push him away. Lamar's heart tightened with anger and betrayal. He could no longer stay silent, no longer stay in the dark. He had to handle this himself. When Lamar entered the house, a dark feeling washed over him. The front door was slightly open. The house was eerily quiet, even though Cassie was supposed to be home. Lamar's heart began to race. He headed toward the bedroom, but to his horror, Cassie wasn't there. Lamar moved through the house until he heard faint sounds coming from the living room. As he approached, he saw Marius standing in the middle of the room, almost as if he had been waiting for him. Marius's face was a mixture of anger and fear. Lamar didn't expect to see him there, in his own home. Fury rose in Lamar's chest. "What are you doing here?" Lamar asked, his voice seething with barely contained rage. Realizing he could no longer hide, Marius tried to make himself look like the victim, his face contorted with desperation. "She made me do this. She manipulated me," Marius said, trying to evoke sympathy. He wanted to twist the situation so that Lamar would see him as the wronged, deceived man. But Lamar wasn't buying any of it. His mind was boiling with anger, and he stepped forward, ready to confront Marius. But before he could do anything, Marius changed tactics. He realized he had been exposed and knew he had nothing left to lose. "You think I'm just going to let you walk away?" Marius's voice turned icy, and then he shouted, "I won't let either of you get rid of me." Losing control, Marius lunged at Lamar with a knife he had hidden in his pocket. In desperation and fear for his life, Lamar wasn't in a position to defend himself. Marius plunged the knife into Lamar's shoulder, wounding him, but not fatally. Blood quickly soaked through Lamar's shirt sleeve, but he kept fighting, trying to push Marius off him. Cassie, hiding in another room, heard the commotion and ran into the living room. The scene she saw was horrifying. Lamar was on the floor trying to defend himself from Marius's frenzied attacks. In that moment, Cassie realized her life, and her husband's, was in mortal danger. Everything happened so fast. Cassie rushed into the kitchen and grabbed the first thing she could find, a heavy cast-iron skillet. She knew she had no other choice if she wanted to save Lamar and herself. Returning to the living room, she saw Marius raise the knife again, ready to deliver a fatal blow to Lamar. Without hesitating, Cassie hit Marius over the head with the skillet. The blow was so strong that Marius collapsed to the floor instantly. He tried to get up but lost consciousness from the impact. Cassie stood there, shaking from shock. She looked at Marius lying on the floor, then shifted her gaze to Lamar, who was struggling to get up despite his wound. In that moment, only one thought ran through her mind. She had killed Marius to save Lamar. Despite the pain, Lamar pulled Cassie into his arms, trying to calm her down. They both knew it was self-defense, but the weight of what had happened was still crushing. Cassie called the police. Her voice trembled as she explained to the operator what had happened. The police and paramedics arrived quickly. Marius was still unconscious, but his condition was critical. The doctors confirmed that the blow to the head had caused his death, despite their attempts to save him. The police took Cassie in for questioning, but her actions were deemed self-defense. The footage from the cameras Lamar had installed, along with the detectives' testimonies, played a crucial role in clearing her name. Lamar and Cassie had survived the fatal conclusion to their nightmare, but their lives would never be the same again. A few months after the tragic events of March 2008, Lamar and Cassie Wilson's lives were forever changed. Even though the investigation ruled Cassie's actions as self-defense, her name and story quickly became the subject of public gossip and condemnation throughout the neighborhood. The city they once called home was now a source of constant stress and anxiety. Cassie remained under official scrutiny. Although all the evidence, camera footage, Lamar's testimony, and the detectives' statements pointed to self-defense, the police and the public still had questions. Cassie became the target of rumors. She could feel how the neighbors, once friendly, now eyed her with suspicion, whispering behind her back. The image of a respectable wife had shattered, and rumors of her affair with Marius spread like wildfire across the community. Mrs. Mace, the elderly neighbor, remained a key player in spreading these rumors. Her version of events fueled the neighbors' curiosity. She would recount how many times she'd seen Marius visit the Wilson home, suggesting that Cassie had deliberately killed him to cover up the affair. In Mace's eyes, Cassie wasn't a victim. These rumors eroded trust in the official version, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and judgment. Lamar, despite standing by his wife, was growing more distant. While his physical wound had healed, the emotional pain lingered. He struggled to rebuild trust in Cassie. It was hard for him to come to terms with what had happened right under his nose. Their marriage, already strained from a lack of intimacy, was now shattered. Every conversation turned into a conflict, with the past inevitably resurfacing. Lamar tried to suppress his pain, but the shadow of Marius haunted them both. The community no longer viewed the Wilsons as one of their own. Although Cassie had been cleared by the law, public opinion was relentless. People turned away when Lamar and Cassie appeared in public. They had become outcasts in their own home, and no matter how hard they tried to start over, their reputation, destroyed by scandal, was beyond repair. Lamar and Cassie made the difficult decision to sell their house and leave the neighborhood they once called home. Their luxurious mansion had become an unbearable reminder of what had happened. Every corner of the house, every room held the shadows of the events they were trying to forget. Soon the house was listed for sale, and the neighbors only welcomed this news. Mrs. Mace continued to fuel interest in the events of that March. She spoke of the Wilsons' ruined home as an example of how even the most successful and prosperous families could hide dark secrets. The gossip spread far beyond their neighborhood, turning the event into something of an urban legend, discussed at parties and gatherings. Lamar and Cassie moved to another city, trying to start a new life, but their marriage was hanging by a thread. Lamar continued to wrestle with feelings of betrayal and shame, while Cassie, emotionally drained, couldn't regain her former confidence. They were both trapped in a whirlpool of the past that refused to release them. Every new attempt to rebuild their relationship was met with the old wounds that surfaced time and again. Under constant pressure, Cassie began seeing a therapist. She struggled with the guilt of knowing her actions had led to Marius's death and the uncertainty of her marriage's future. Nightmares and anxiety plagued her constantly. Lamar, while trying to support her, also felt lost. His vision of family and marriage had been shattered, and he couldn't shake the thought that perhaps he, too, was partly to blame for what had happened. A year after the tragedy, public attention toward the Wilson family began to fade, but the consequences remained. The community they had once lived in was no longer the same. Gossip, rumors, and broken bonds among neighbors became a reminder of how easily secret passions and hidden desires could destroy lives. Lamar and Cassie left their home, but they couldn't leave the past behind.